Welcome back to Memories and Lessons. Did you know that BioWare actually made a DS game? Not only a DS game, a Sonic DS game? Yes, it did. That game was called Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. And it marks the point at which I transitioned from programming into production. I was actually on Jade Empire 2, and when Jade was moved to the Unreal Engine, I asked to move into a role where I could learn to understand Unreal better. I've mentioned this before, but the consequence of that request was I actually became the stream architect for the Jade Empire and Mass Effect 1 tech streams. Not really solving my problem, didn't really get my hands very dirty. Pretty shortly after moving into that role, the handheld group came into being, led by a different producer at BioWare who's actually brought in specifically for that role. But they needed a lead programmer, so I jumped at that opportunity to get back into more direct programming and moved from stream architect on the Unreal stream onto the newly formed handheld group. And the game we were going to make was a Sonic RPG. The origins of this game are a little cloudy. Ray Musica is a huge Sonic the Hedgehog fan, so likely he is the instigator of that, but it's a little fuzzy. It's also possible that Sega came to us to work with them and Ray suggested Sonic as a possibility. It's not super clear to me. This is back before we were owned by EA, so we were still independent, looking for publishers for each of our games. And this game was going to be published by Sega, obviously, since they control Sonic. At first blush, it might seem like a pretty strange marriage. Sonic the Hedgehog, known for being fast, speed, that kind of reflex-based gameplay, to be paired up with BioWare, certainly not known for action, and not only that, to be a turn-based RPG. But I think Sonic actually has deeper legs. It's got a pretty deep legacy. I'll talk in a little bit about some of the problems with that legacy, but there's quite a bit there. From Sega's side, it's certainly possible that they were looking at BioWare as someone who could potentially expand Sonic beyond the titles that it had been in before. Sega really wants Sonic to be their Mario, and Mario certainly has had games beyond the platformers. Sonic has been less successful in that space. It is certainly quite conceivable that when they came to us looking for someone who could expand the roster of genres that Sonic worked in. So we're building an RPG. One of the first things I'm going to take on is to build a stat system for this game. Those of you who know me, or those of you who've been following this channel religiously, will be aware that stats are a source of a very common bug, which is transition bugs, specifically the dying dead bug, where creatures have difficulty moving from an alive state to a dead state because there can be race conditions and other issues that occur in the middle of the act of dying that can cause lots of problems. So I decided that I was going to fix this problem once and for all. So the stat system for Sonic Chronicles is built from the ground up to tackle this issue. Don't remember the details of this system. These are the things I do remember. It was event driven, so any time you wanted to change a stat, you had to go through an event. This gave the system an opportunity to run code against that stat to check for minimums and maximums, and also apply effects on the change. So you would have an event that would fire when your hit points changed, and this would be what would cause the damage animation to play, whatever VFX was going to be applied. But then it also could then check against the minimum hit points and see if you were dying. So because everything went through a single system, a single set of transition systems, it avoided the dying dead problem because the system was built around looking for these transition changes. Now, at the end of the day, Sonic Chronicles is a turn-based RPG. So while I think the system is very clever, it's pretty dramatically overkill for a game which doesn't really have race conditions because only one thing can happen at a time. So I guess my first lesson from Sonic Chronicles is to build what you need. This stat system was a bit of a passion project for me, and it didn't take a ton of time, but honestly is engineering effort that wasn't really necessary in a project as small as this with a combat system that was the combat system of Sonic Chronicles. And I think we knew that, if I recall correctly, we knew that when I was starting to write this system. We knew there was going to be turn-based. So I had enough information to know that maybe I didn't need such a carefully engineered stat system. This stat system was also very data-driven, where minimums and maximums were driven through a data file that indicated what to do, what event to fire when you hit a minimum, what event to fire when you hit a maximum, what minimum and maximums actually were. I'm a huge fan of making things data-driven. My opinion is if you're engineering something once, it's probably worth engineering it to be used more than once. And the biggest and easiest way to get that is to make it so that at least some of the system is driven through data. This is also why in previous videos I've talked about how much I love the 2DA, because that is a way to inject data into a system that would otherwise be hard-coded. Just a little note on this. There has been a trend I've seen more recently to move a lot of things into a scripting language or some sort of visual scripting language like Blueprint. I don't really consider that to be a data-driven format. All you've really done is you've moved the programming effort from the programmers onto a designer or some other person that's now working within a different programming language, one that might actually have a much worse debugger than the one that the programmer has. Now, don't get me wrong, handing this power over to a designer, the designer who is directly responsible for the behavior of something, can be incredibly powerful. It's just not what I mean when I talk about being data-driven. When I talk about data-driven, I'm talking about something that is much more pure data, where either the data is in some sort of chart form or there are individual files for each of the items that are being created. And the advantage of that is that it allows you to parse the data in different ways and to do things on a larger scale. Something that was quite common in BioWare games in the 2000s and the 90s was to do data passes, to go in and increase the amount of damage that every single weapon in the entire game did. When you're data-driven, that's pretty easy. When everything is in a scripting language of some sort, that's not very easy at all. And it can result in a lot of errors being introduced in the process. Now, the event system for the stat system for Sonic Chronicles was, by the loosest definition of scripting language, a scripting language. If you remember my video on Baldur's Gate 1, I said one of my lessons was, if you write a scripting language, it's going to get used for more things than you meant it to be used for. Compared to BG Script, the scripting language for Baldur's Gate, this thing was an abomination. It is a single line with 5 or 6 numbers in a flat text file that's parsed. It's designed entirely to be the data source for the SAT system. But when we started to implement conversations, we needed a scripting language to handle the logic of the conversations. And we had one sitting around, sort of, that basically met our needs, basically. So that's what got used. So again, if you write a scripting language, it's gonna get used for other things. Even if it's really horrible, it's going to be used for things that you didn't mean it to be used for. So keep that in mind if you're writing a scripting language. That shouldn't make you shy away from being data-driven, but keep it in mind. So I'm the lead programmer now. I'm working on my stat system, and we are starting to assemble a team. And some of those people are supposed to be coming from Mass Effect 1. But we're just having an incredibly hard time getting those people free from Mass Effect 1. And a lesson that I'm going to put down here that I'm not entirely sure that I ever really learned at BioWare was that the biggest project is always going to win. And we were losing these fights against Mass Effect, trying to pry people loose. People were coming 6 months late. And for a project as small as Sonic, 6 months is a long time. In a studio that is doing multiple projects at the same time, which even more than today, BioWare definitely was at this period of time, you are going to have conflicts over resources because people are going to be moving between projects. In fact, one of the reasons to have multiple projects at a studio is to allow people to flow between projects because there's always a need somewhere, and when one project doesn't need them as much, they've got somewhere else to go. But the projects aren't going to ever line up perfectly, so there's always going to be conflict. And unless you have some sort of very formal process for the movement of people between projects, which I've never seen, basically the biggest thing is always going to win, and the little things are going to get starved out. That being said, I love small teams. Sonic was very small, never really much above 20 people. You know everybody. You can really keep on top of the work that everyone is working on. And if anyone is listening that is the GM of a studio, I would recommend trying to figure out a way that you can have a small team running and working on the go. Because a small team, regardless of what it's doing, if it's doing handheld work or mobile work, or if it's doing remasters, a small team is an opportunity to let people stretch. You can put people into roles that they aren't quite ready for, and they can stretch and grow into those roles where the stakes are quite a bit lower. And if they fail, well, there wasn't that much money on the line. But if they succeed, now you've got someone who's ready to take on even bigger roles in the future. Studios can have a problem with bench strength, with having people who are ready to step into senior roles, because there's almost a sort of a gap between the most senior roles on a project and the next level down. So sometimes you can get into a situation where if you lose a senior person from a senior role, the people who reported to that person aren't ready for that role because they haven't had the experience across some of the different aspects of the role. Maybe they haven't done management. Maybe they haven't done performance management. Maybe they haven't dealt with salary or budget. Maybe they haven't gone through an entire project cycle. Now, obviously, this is a failure of mentorship and training, but that doesn't change the reality that this is something that does continuously happen at a lot of studios. A small team gives you an opportunity to give them those experiences. Even if you then roll them back into a more typical role on a bigger project, they've had the experience of going through an entire cycle and experiencing all the parts of that senior role. So if you need someone, they're ready. Now, Sonic had a very small technical team, but we needed a conversation system because this was an RPG. We still needed you to be able to talk to people. Dragon Age was in development at this point and actually had a tool set working for their conversation system. So we just stole that and put it into Sonic. Sonic Chronicles, the Dark Brotherhood, is actually the game which shipped the Dragon Age conversation system before Dragon Age because we were just faster. While we were able to kind of shove that conversation system into this tiny engine, it was a bit of a trick with a lot of crowbars and filing involved. And you're probably guessing one of the casualties in that process was the scripting language. I can't remember if Dragon Age Origins had a scripting language existing at this point yet or not, but in any event, there was no way that a DS was going to be using the scripting language designed to run on a PC of the time. So instead of that, we used the horrible event system that I wrote for the stat system. But we had a pretty fancy conversation system for a little DS title attached to a really horrible scripting system, but still. I think the lesson there is when you're small, You got to be scrappy. You got to look and dig around in other people's yards and other people's garbage, looking for things to steal, looking for things to borrow, looking for things to transform, because that is a huge force multiplier. And honestly, I think that's a lesson that even bigger teams wouldn't be hurt by learning a little bit more. Small teams require you to wear a lot of hats. The producers also did data entry and QA. I was still programming, even though I had made the transition to leading this project. I don't really know exactly the moment in the development when this happened, but this is basically what happened. The person in charge of Sonic Chronicles went to take over the Dragon Age project, leaving a hole on Sonic Chronicles for production leadership, for an executive producer. And I stepped into that role. And I think that on a small team, that's the reality. You wear a lot of hats. If you need an executive producer, you're an executive producer. If you need someone to keep programming, you keep programming. If you need someone to be QA, you're QA. You do what needs to be done to ship the project. You don't have specialization to the same degree that you have on larger projects. Is it inefficient? Arguably so, but when you have needs that are less than one entire person, it's not exactly inefficient. I'm certainly not the best QA person, but you provide a little bit of extra bandwidth. And if you need 3.6 QA people, rather than having 4, you can have 3 and then make up the difference with other people on the team. HD development has become more and more specialized over my 23 years in the industry. And I don't actually think that that's a net positive. There's a couple of reasons why I think it's happened. The first is, like I mentioned before there, in the service of perceived efficiency. Someone dedicated to doing skinning can get really good at it and can get faster than most other people. And there's truth to that. The other part of it is that they can get better at it, so you get higher quality. So you do arguably get higher quality results at a more efficient speed than you do with having only generalists. But what you're also doing is you're building in this brittleness to your team. If you only have one person who knows how to make materials and that person is sick, then you have no way to make materials. So I do think that there may be a better middle ground where you allow for specializations, but you maintain some ability to be generalists so that when it's necessary, people can get other work done. You should be wearing lots of hats. And I do believe that being able to wear a lot of hats, being willing to pick up a shovel when a hole needs to be dug, is a critical skill. And honestly, one of the reasons why I've had the success that I've had is because there's just a willingness to do what needs to be done. The Marines used to say, every Marine a rifleman. I don't actually believe that that is their motto any longer, but I think there's power in that statement, because if everyone has the ability to get their hands dirty in at least one discipline, then that lets you apply an immense amount of additional oomph, additional firepower when it comes to that moment when that is needed. One of the things that's really interesting or amusing or distressing about companies that held IP in the 80s and 90s is control of that IP often got chopped up in some really weird ways. So let me give you some examples. You've seen this with Marvel. It's probably the most famous example, where control of Spider-Man went one place and control of the X-Men went the other place. The other thing that you see as well is the rights to make Spider-Man Popsicles is owned by some random person. So you still see Spider-Man Popsicles every once in a while. Sonic is exactly the same. Control of that IP is a mess. It's carved up between a bunch of different things, including some random person that owns rights to a popsicle. And the Sonic that people who are really fans of the storytelling probably think about is the one where it's a society of anthropomorphized animals, and they're fighting against Eggman or Dr. Robotnik, and maybe it's sort of post-apocalyptic, but that setting is not controlled by Sega. That setting is controlled by Archie Comics. So we couldn't work in that world. We had to work in the world that Sega controlled, which meant that we couldn't use the characters and concepts and things that were controlled by the Archie Comic Corporation, which is weird because it actually means that a lot of what you think about when you think about storytelling in Sonic isn't actually controlled by the company that owns the Sonic IP. It's controlled by someone else. So when you want to do storytelling in the Sonic universe, you have to work around that control. So I guess a little lesson for anyone creating an IP, and maybe this is not really realistic, but as much as you can, maintain control of your IP. Don't carve it up into a million little pieces, because at some future date, you're going to regret that. Now, I realize reality is reality, and you might just find yourself in a situation where money is money, and you're going to sell control of your teddy bear IP to the Popsicle guy because you just need $50,000 to keep the lights on for another month. So I don't know how useful that lesson actually is, but there you go. I mentioned this in the balance video. A lesson that I learned on Sonic Chronicles is that balance is very difficult. The balance of the combat system in Sonic was the balance point was very narrow. What you really ideally want is a plateau of balance where people at different skill levels with characters at different power levels can all have a reasonably fun, balanced combat experience. Because the reality is even a single person, their skill level is going to vary between games. If they've had 2 glasses of wine, then their experience with combat is going to be very different than if they're at the top of their game. The problem with a lot of combat systems, and Sonic's is like this, is that often instead of having a plateau of balance, they have a razor's edge of balance, where the difference between too easy and too hard is very narrow, and that point of perfect balance is very, very narrow. So, unbeknownst to basically everyone else on the team, I actually wrote an automated balance system for Sonic to sort of flatten down the combat experience for Sonic Chronicles, giving it sort of an ability to adapt to what was happening in the combat system and essentially kind of learn the way you played and try to give you a more balanced experience based upon what was happening, what was going on with you. Now, you could argue that essentially what you're doing by doing that is you're essentially flattening the quality down as well, and I think that's probably fair. The difference between a perfect experience with the un-auto-balance system and a perfect experience with the auto-balance system is probably making the experience a little bit worse, but it makes the number of good combat experiences much larger, as opposed to it being basically never. It's most of the combat experiences in Sonic Chronicles. So ideally design your system to have that balanced plateau where there's a lot of different ways you can have a good balanced combat experience, but I'm not against auto balancing if it allows you to improve the average experience of your players. Something that got created on Sonic Chronicles by the art team, by the animators, was a hand animated intro for the game. It is really cool, but it is also quite a bit different than the other things that existed for Sonic at the time. It's squishy and it's stretchy. I really liked it, but while it was being developed, I warned the art team that Sega was probably not going to go for this, and they wanted to work on it anyway, so I let them. And then I fought with Sega for quite a long time to try to get them to approve this, but ultimately I lost that fight, and that animation has never seen the light of day. And I think the lesson there is sometimes when you're a leader, sometimes when you know things that your team doesn't, you have to be willing to kill that feature because you know it's not going to make it. And rather than letting them get super invested in it and then trying to fight for its existence, I think it would have been more fair to the team for me to have had the hard conversation earlier and killed that animation, killed that movie a lot sooner in its development. Just because something is cool doesn't mean it's going to get approved, especially if someone else is controlling the IP. Ultimately, Sonic Chronicles is an introduction to BioWare games. It shares a lot of the characteristics of other BioWare games of the time, but it's obviously targeting kids. Doesn't have romances. The themes are much more simple. And I think that's great, but I think we also made a big mistake when we marketed this game, because we marketed it as if it was going to be like any other BioWare game at the time, instead of marketing it as a game that was a BioWare game, a game with BioWare heritage, but that was targeting a younger audience. So as a result, when the game came out, there was some negative feedback on it because it didn't rise to the level of the BioWare games that were around it. So to help illustrate this, I'm going to do a quick reaction to the trailer that we made for Sonic Chronicles.
Sega. In a dramatic new story, Sonic and 10 friends face a dangerous new enemy. Each must use their unique strengths and team up in combat and strategy to overcome obstacles in over 20 amazing locations. Some you might recognize, many you've never seen before. Get ready for an incredible adventure unlike any other, with Sonic in a whole new role with all new rules. Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. Available now.
So I'd forgotten exactly how in a world that trailer was. I think my point comes across a little bit in that trailer. There's a lot of raising of stakes, a lot of epic music, a lot of driving beat that I think is setting an expectation that isn't ultimately delivered by the game, which is it has big stakes, but big stakes presented through the lens of a kid's game. But I think more than this trailer, I think the way that we spoke about the game actually really set expectations wrong. The lesson there is that you need to market to your audience, not to the audience you might wish for, but the audience you actually are trying to get. Now, I think I may have overlearned this lesson when it came to the way that we talked about Anthem, because there we were so careful to make people understand that this was not a traditional BioWare game that I think we actually scared away some of the BioWare core that might have enjoyed the storytelling aspects of that game. But we'll talk about that more when we catch up to Anthem. During development of Sonic Chronicles, after I'd become the executive producer, they brought in someone to provide media training, not just for me, for the leaders of the other projects as well. This is the only time I ever had, I think, any formal media training. I got some pointers once in a while from people, but this is the only time where I ever had someone actually have me present and then provide pointed media feedback to that presentation. Obviously, I've had feedback on presentations before, including ones to the press, but not from a media consultant. I don't remember that feedback very much at all, except for one very specific thing. At the end, after I presented the game, the guy looked at me and said, "But is the game fun?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, is the game fun? Because you just presented for 15 minutes and you never once said that the game is fun." And that is a piece of feedback that has stuck with me forever. And it's not necessarily that you should say that your game is fun, because weirdly, in this industry, sometimes when you say that with certain audiences, it's going to be interpreted as being less mature, more childish, but it's something worth thinking about. What are the things on your game that go without saying, because maybe you need to say them? While we were working on Sonic Chronicles, BioWare actually got purchased by EA. So Sonic Chronicles was published by Sega in late 2008, but we were owned by EA at that point in time. And then the handheld group entered this period of trying to figure out what we were going to do next. We pitched quite a few different things. We had Imugi. Imugi is a kind of Korean dragon. Ray was really interested in BioWare having its own Pokemon, and Imugi was an attempt to try to figure out how to do that. I pitched a game set in the Jade Empire universe, which was a base building game called Valley of the Sprightly Stones. I pitched an RPG using the Scrabble license, which EA controlled at the time, called Scrabble Quest. And then the game that ultimately went a little bit further was Mass Effect Corsair. Mass Effect Corsair was going to be an RPG, but an RPG where you flew around a ship, like a rogue trader, essentially, and you would explore the less explored parts of the Mass Effect universe, arm your ship and build your ship up. Mass Effect Corsair got a little bit further along, but ultimately it died for a couple of different reasons. The first reason, which didn't matter very much for BioWare when it came to Sonic, was cogs. The cartridges on the DS at the time of Sonic Chronicles were quite expensive, and the amount of storage space on them increased their price, going from, I think the cheapest was $3.50 up to the most expensive being $10.50. Sonic Chronicles uses that $10.50 cartridge. So mathematically, the difference between $3.50 and $10.50 for a game that's only selling for $40 is pretty much the difference between life and death. And when we were pitching Mass Effect Corsair, the assumption was that we were going to need that biggest cartridge, or maybe the $9.50 cartridge. And honestly, looking back on it, there was no way that that was going to fly at EA because it just cut the margins too much. But additionally, there was just this incredible amount of pattern matching going on within the sales organization at EA. And when they looked at Mass Effect Corsair, they couldn't pattern match it to anything because this was a spaceflight game, it was an RPG, it was on the DS, it wasn't like anything else there. So they would give it sales projections in the tens of thousands. I think the highest we ever managed to get the forecast on that game was 50,000 units. So again, if you believe that number, which I never did, but if you believe that number, yeah, it doesn't make any sense to make a game that's going to sell 50,000 units that's going to have a budget in the millions of dollars. But ultimately, I think the reason that it died is because I don't think that EA wanted to be in the DS business. So everything was against the pitches. But we didn't know that. And I think the lesson there is if you're getting no, it's useful to understand where that no is coming from. If the no is coming from, we want to be in this business, but you're just not pitching right, or we don't like this exact pitch, that's a very different thing than if that no is coming from a perspective of, we don't really want to be in this business at all. We just don't want to tell you that. Because if it's the second, well, then you should just stop tilting at that windmill, move on, and find a better thing to pitch in a different area where your organization is excited. I started on the Mass Effect Corsair project, and we got a little bit running. There was some space flight and a little bit of combat working. But then the executive producer of Jade Empire 2, which was now Revolver, resigned, and they needed someone to take over that project. So again, I moved to where the need was greatest, and I became the executive producer of Revolver, a project that I was originally lead programmer, and then stream architect, and then ultimately executive producer. Those of you good at connecting the dots will realize that Revolver couldn't have been a very long project for me since I was on Dragon Age Origins for its last year, and Sonic Chronicles didn't ship until late 2008. That will be where we rejoin this series. We'll be on Revolver and the last days of that project. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone else who might be surprised that BioWare worked on a handheld title and a Sonic title. If you enjoyed this, give this video a thumbs up. A special thanks to my members. They provide support that helps keep this channel running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there is a link down in the description. If you are interested in picking up a copy of Sonic Chronicles, the Dark Brotherhood, it is likely one of the rarer BioWare games. I will put some affiliate links down in the description as well. It is probably the one that will eventually be lost in the sands of time. So if you have a DS or something else that can play those, maybe pick it up now. One random piece of Sonic Chronicles trivia for the few people who made it all the way to the end with me. The Sega side publisher for Sonic Chronicles The Dark Brotherhood's name was Kirby, which is hilarious to me. I'm not entirely sure how common the name Kirby actually is, but having Kirby as the publisher for Sonic the Hedgehog tickles my funny bone. Okay, anyway, thank you for sticking with me to the end. I will see you again soon. Thank you.